How do you tell the story of African American history in 24 books? For Black History Month, Ibram Kendi will be here to talk about books that capture each decade of race and racism in America.
People are familiar with The Birth of a Nation. Well, that motion picture was based on this book, The Klansman. And basically in this book depicts the Ku Klux Klan as the saviors of white people who were being terrorized by black politicians and voters during the Reconstruction era.
Why is it creatures like to consume, literally, their own? Bill Schutt will be here to tell us about his new book, Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History.
When these hatchlings come out, they squirm all over their moms. And people wondered about that behavior. And what they found was that these hatchlings were literally gripping onto their mother's skin and peeling her like a grape and consuming her skin.
And we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Ibram Kendi joins us now. He is a professor of history at the University of Florida, and he won the National Book Award for Nonfiction for his book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. Ibram, congratulations, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
So you did this great thing in the book review this week. You put together a decade-by-decade history of race and racism in American history through books, a book per decade. And this was your great idea. So tell us a little bit about why you decided to do this.
Well, I think in writing Stamped from the Beginning, I had to recognize the roles that books played in sort of the history of racist ideas, and I found that books were quite influential, throughout American history. And so I think remembering that, and then sort of remembering, so of course we're in Black History Month, thinking of a new sort of way to teach readers and explain to readers about the ways in which books have made an impact on American history. I thought that this would be, a great way.
And what you did is interesting because it's not this is the best book for each decade by a long shot. How did you pick the book to kind of represent each decade of American history?
So I thought about what racial debates were going on, what institutions were being defended or advanced, racial institutions. And I thought about the books that more or less challenged or inserted themselves in the middle of those debates, the books that even prompted those debates, or even the books that ended those debates, or even I thought about what books from these decades still, the ideas in them still persist within our racial discourse. And so I was thinking about either having an impact at the time, a huge influential impact, or books, and more so their ideas, are still impacting the discourse today.
Some of the titles that you picked are very familiar to American readers. Uncle Tom's Cabin, The New Jim Crow very recently, To Kill a Mockingbird. And some of them, at least I'd never heard of. And I'll start actually with the first book on your list to represent the decade of the 1770s. You picked Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral by Phillis Wheatley. Tell us about this book.
So, of course, Phillis Wheatley was, a very sort of pioneering African-American poet. And when she published this book, it was in the middle, of course, of the American Revolution. But even more specifically, there was this debate about whether black people were capable of freedom, whether black people were capable of civilization. And abolitionists used this book to make the case that black people were capable of freedom and civilization. And it sort of, especially founding father Benjamin Rush and others. And so it sparked this huge debate in 1773 in places like Philadelphia and Boston and other sort of port cities about slavery. And so I think, it was really the first major debate about slavery in America. I mean, there had been earlier debates, but not at the scale of this debate as a result of this book.
And this was the first ever book by an African-American woman.
Correct, yes.
Is it still in print?
Yes, I think people are still, I know professors who still teach from the book.
Mm-hmm.
Phillis Wheatley, of course, is an amazing and a very important figure as it relates to the canon of African American literature.
And for the next decade, you take a very different tack with Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia. But you also cite another book, which I found fascinating, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, which I think is relatively well known as a slave narrative. But for those who haven't read this book, tell us about that.
I think what's interesting about this book is the author, Equiano, really takes the reader from his capture in West Africa, to the Middle Passage, to slavery, and so for readers to be able to see the sort of full course, of the enslavement experience, he provides it, and there were quite a few slave narratives during this period, but this one became the most famous.
Some of the books, as I mentioned, are not books that one would necessarily recommend in terms of the ideas contained within. And the book that you chose for the first decade of the 19th century certainly falls into that category. What was the book? An essay on the causes of variety of complexion and figure in the human species. And why did you choose that?
So really in the first few decades of the United States, there was a very prominent academic theory. And that theory was that the original humans were white and that black people had become white when white people migrated to Africa, sort of their skins were blackened. And so these theorists made the case that the way to eliminate blackness and therefore the racial problem was to encourage black people to migrate back up to the cooler north, whether that's Boston or even London. And Samuel Stanhope Smith was the principal theorist of what I call physical assimilation. Mm-hmm. And he advocated for black people to basically become literally white. And when there were actually sort of whitening blacks at the time, like Henry Moss, who was this person who had vitiligo, and so people in 1796 he sort of did exhibitions, and people were like, you see, this is possible. And so Samuel Stanhope Smith, but more specifically his first and second edition on the essay on the causes of variety, I think was the leading theorist of physical assimilation.
And he was the president of Princeton.
Yes. So he was a very well-known and very powerful academic voice.
And you write that his racist idea of the lighter and straighter the better still demeans after all these years. What was it like reading this for the first time for you?
I think it was a revelation because, I know the ways in which this notion that the lighter the skin, the more beautiful, or the straighter the hair, the more beautiful, it's still persisting. And to find one of the major texts that sort of pioneered and circulated that idea, I think was quite revealing to me. And this is, one of those pioneering texts.
What's interesting about the books you chose is that they each encompass a notion of blackness, of African Americans of the time. It's sort of all of the great and terrible ideas of race that have prevailed during various periods of our history. Tell us about the choice you made for the 1820s, An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World by David Walker.
That was one of the more difficult selections. And I chose David Walker's Appeal because we're more familiar with the William Lloyd Garrison and Harriet Beecher Stowe and the white abolitionist movement. Mm-hmm. We're not necessarily as familiar with the pioneering blacks like David Walker and Maria Stewart, who sort of pioneered this abolitionist movement in the black community. That was, of course, intertwined with the white abolitionist movement. And I think this text was very fundamental in doing so. And it was fundamental in galvanizing slave resistance in the South because this book was sort of smuggled into the South, which then led a lot of Southern leaders to call for Walker's jailing.
I'm interested in the publication history and how these books circulated. Walker was from Boston. Was the book published by a Boston publishing house, and how did it get to slaves in the South?
So yes, it was published in Boston, and he was actually a seamstress. And so what he would do is he would basically sew the text into the clothes of black shipmen who would then, go into the South and then, of course, take the appeal out of their clothes and, of course, circulate it. I mean, it was a quite ingenious thing that Walker and many of these courageous black shipmen did to ensure that this book got into the hands of people who were enslaved.
Through the 1840s and 1850s, the books become quite well known. You have, of course, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass and of Sojourner Truth and Uncle Tom's Cabin, and on the origin of species. But when we get to the Civil War period with 1860s, two books that focus, I believe, both on biology and evolution in the wake of Darwin's book, The Principles of Biology by Herbert Spencer and Hereditary Genius by Sir Francis Galton. Tell us about those two books.
Sure. So I think most people have heard the term survival of the fittest. And so that term came out of Herbert Spencer's The Principles of Biology. Most people have heard of Charles Darwin, but Herbert Spencer was the principal sort of voice for social Darwinism in the United States, specifically through this book, The Principles of Biology. I think most people have heard of the eugenics movement.
Yes.
The founder and the pioneer of the eugenics movement was Sir Francis Galton, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin. And the book that sort of pioneered that movement was Hereditary Genius in 1869.
I want to go actually into the 20th century, skip ahead for a minute. The book you selected for the first decade of the 20th century is called The Klansman, an historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan by Thomas Dixon. What is that book?
So that book, people are, again, familiar with the film, the pioneering, the first major motion picture, which is The Birth of a Nation. Well, that motion picture was based on this book, The Klansman. Mm-hmm. And basically in this book, as well as his other books, he more or less sort of depicts the Ku Klux Klan as these saviors of white people who were being terrorized by black politicians and voters during the Reconstruction era. And so that's the sort of story that he more or less tells in a few sentences.
And it's interesting because you chose that book over The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. Why did you choose to highlight that book over The Souls of Black Folk?
So, yeah, that was a very difficult choice, to say the least. And I think because when that book was published in 1905, it was really the tail end of a series of Jim Crow policies that had been put in place. And that book, possibly more than any other text, solidified or justified basically Jim Crow. That's why I sort of identified him as Jim Crow's novelist laureate. I mean, he sort of justified the Jim Crow era, which, of course, would last for, another sort of 60 years. And so I think that's the reason why I chose it. It had such a huge impact to substantiate Jim Crow at the time.
It's interesting because you've done this with a few choices where you highlight a book that isn't necessarily exemplary in its ideas over books that one might think of as quote-unquote better books. The next example being Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell for the 1930s, which was also the decade that saw Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God and Native Son by Richard Wright. Why did you choose Gone with the Wind?
Well, first, Their Eyes Were Watching God really became the popular book that we know of in the 1970s. And so it wasn't necessarily as popular in the 1930s and 1940s. Certainly Native Son was. But the reason why I chose Gone with the Wind, it's the most popular American book, behind of course, the Bible. And really, that text and, of course, the movie really sort of hardened this sort of plantation fiction genre and its notions that black people were shiftless and docile and loyal, and that white enslavers were noble, which, of course, reinforced, once again, Jim Crow ideas that, to a certain extent, said the same thing. And so I think for its popularity, in its long-standing popularity and even its sort of impact on the discourse at the time, I chose that book.
For the 1990s, I'm moving ahead again, you chose two books written by conservative academics. The one that you ultimately picked is The Bell Curve, which was by Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray. The subtitle is Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life, a very controversial book, and one slightly less well-known now, but was also made a big splash at the time, positive and negative, was America in Black and White by a married pair of academics, Stephen and Abigail Thernstrom. Why those two books for the 1990s? I mean, this was the era of like political correctness on campus, and I'm curious why those two for the 1990s.
First, again, that was, I guess you're hearing a similar tune about how difficult the decision was, and I think first and foremost, the Bell Curve. I mean, it really sparked one of the most intense academic debates on race in history. And even more so, the debate over standardized tests and whether black people, or whether the academic achievement gap was caused by genes or environment, happened at a time in which standardized tests were, to a certain extent, on their way out. I mean, there was a movement in the 1980s, specifically as a result of books like The Mismeasure of Man and others that sort of caused Americans to sort of rethink the validity of standardized tests. And I think this debate actually reinforced the validity of standardized tests, and of course, standardized tests only expanded, over the next 2 decades. And in terms of American Black and White, it first of all came in 1997, and that year was the year President Clinton tried to spark this national conversation on race, which led to this backlash in which people tried to make the case that America was colorblind and that the people who were talking about racial discrimination were actually the real racists. And so this notion of the race card, of liberal racism, really emerged during that year, and there were many books that put forth those ideas, most prominently America in Black and White.
So for listeners who are hearing you discuss all of these books, some of which, again, are relatively unknown, not widely read among readers today, which books would you urge people to pick up to get a better understanding, again, focusing on the lesser-known books, of a history that has not gotten as much attention as it should?
I would say Crania America, but it's not necessarily a fluid read as many of these other books. But I think
that was published in 1839 by Samuel Morton.
Yes, and I think many Americans, since they've heard of Charles Darwin and The Origin of Species, what they don't recognize is that book and evolutionary theory ended the reign of what was known as polygenesis. And so if you read The Origin of Species, the preface, Darwin directly challenges polygenesis. Polygenesis was the theory that each racial group had its own creation story, had its own sort of origin, and was a separate species. And it was the principal line of thinking on race in academic circles until 1859. And the debate over polygenesis or monogenesis lasted for centuries. And so this book, Crania America, was the most important book on polygenesis in American history in terms of making this theory popular in academic circles. And Samuel Morton himself became one of the more popular celebrity sort of academics in the United States.
I know how hard this was to narrow these down, and I can hear it in your voice, kind of the pained having to make these decisions. What book got left off that you just, couldn't fit in, but you would urge people to read?
Wow. Let's see. I would say Beyond the Melting Pot, which was a book that was written in 1963 by Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Nathan Glazer. And many people are familiar with the Moynihan Report that came in 1965,
right,
and talked about the black family as being pathological because of the abundance of single-parent households. But that report directly came out of this earlier book that was very well known and really a capstone of American sociology in 1963. And it really sort of talked about the ways in which the black family was pathological, but even more importantly, African-American culture did not exist. And I'm mentioning this because it was part of the cause of this split between civil rights and black power. And so the black power emerged. Activists were talking about the ways in which African-American culture did exist and was worth valuing, and it really created this debate that Americans have been having ever since over what people would call identity politics today, and over the relationship between race and class, and so I would suggest that book.
I'm going to take us into the next decade and ask what you're working on next, because I'm sure that's a question you're getting a lot after winning the National Book Award for Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. What's your next book about?
So my next book is tentatively titled How to Be an Anti-Racist. And in Stamped from the Beginning, I not only chronicled the history of racist ideas, but I also chronicled the history of anti-racist ideas that challenged racist ideas over the course of American history. And so, in How to Be an Anti-Racist, I want to sort of take a lot of that research and really give Americans a very practical and concise and straightforward understanding of how to be an anti-racist. So we can move past this move of, I'm not a racist, or I'm not a racist, or I don't want to be a racist, or how do I not be racist, and instead start thinking about how to be an anti-racist, how to truly believe that the racial groups are equal.
Presumably someone maybe 100 years from now will pull together another one of these amazing decade-by-decade guides, and your book will be on there.
I don't know.
Ibram, thank you so much. This is the perfect reading list for Black History Month, I think. It's just equally horrifying and inspiring, but most of all, just deeply informative. So thank you again.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And it was, even though it was difficult, it was fun too.
Ibram Kendi put together a decade-by-decade history of race and racism in America, one book per decade of American history, for this week's book review, and he is the author again of Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. Bill Schutt joins us now. His new book is called Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History. Bill, thank you for being here.
It's terrific to be here. Thank you for having me.
I want to start with the title, because I just learned that this is not the title in England, that in England the title is Eat Me. So I'm curious, which was the original title?
Eat Me.
Eat Me. And then they just decided Americans would not enjoy that?
Yeah, something like that.
That's really funny. So are you, did you give it the title Eat Me?
Yes, yeah.
And then it was retitled.
And I think it was retitled brilliantly, to tell you the truth.
Okay, good. So you're happy with both the titles to your
Very
book?
happy, yeah.
Excellent. Okay, a good position to be in. It's an interesting subject. Before we get to it, I just want to talk a little bit about your day job, because you're a professor of biology at Long Island University, and also you have this nice title of being a research associate in residence at the American Museum of Natural History, which, like, to an outsider sounds like you get to just sort of stroll among the stacks in the back rooms and look in the little drawers.
That's exactly what I do.
Is it really?
Oh, yeah. I'm incredibly lucky. I just get to go in whenever I want and sort of hit the stacks or go to the specimen jars and start pulling things out and looking at them. And it's been that way for quite a long time. I'm very, very lucky to be able to do that.
What's the coolest thing you discovered in a jar at the Museum of Natural History?
Oh, let's see. Found a number of neat things having to do with vampire bats back in the day which was probably about 25 years ago, when the party line about vampire bats, there were three of them, was a vampire bat is a vampire bat is a vampire bat. They were all going to act the same, and there's not a whole lot of differences between them.
But there are good vampire bats and bad vampire bats.
Well, there are vampire bats that feed on birds,
Mm-hmm.
and there are vampire bats that feed on creatures on the ground. So
Mm-hmm.
they have a lot of adaptations for both. So, for example, the vampire bats on the ground would do this really neat move where after they were done blood feeding, they would catapult themselves into the air because they've just eaten half their body weight in blood. in order to take off. And so I thought that the other species would do the same thing. So I built a force platform at Cornell with a bunch of friends, and we went down to Trinidad and brought back 2 of the different species. And while I was down there collecting, I explained to the Trinidadian researchers, I said, yeah, I'm going to put these bats on a force platform and going to jump them. I'm going to measure the differences in their jumps. And they just kind of shook his head in this great Trinidadian accent, just said, white-winged vampire bat don't jump, man. And I said, huh? And he said, no, they don't jump. They're feeding on birds up in the trees. Mm-hmm. There's no reason to jump after they get done feeding on a blood meal. They just simply release and fly off. So after that, it was the anatomy involved with that, the behavior, how they evolved differently.
I think that people can probably, listeners, tell that your specialty, your area of research specialty is bats, and your first book was on blood feeding. Was it a natural progression into let's look at eating other parts of the body?
I don't know about eating other parts of the body, but Dark Banquet was about demystifying the whole concept of blood feeding and vampirism in nature, and blood as well, which was completely misunderstood.
It's much nicer than one would think.
Yeah, it is. It's wonderful. but I'd found, like Cannibalism, that there were really 2 sets of books out there, and one set was extremely sensationalized, mm-hmm. and the other was really academic. Mm-hmm. And in the middle, that's where I found this niche where you could go in, be entertaining, look at it from a scientific viewpoint without all the jargon, and then have some humor in there. And I think that's something I'm interested in doing. Is demystifying things that you might not think are when you think about cannibals, you think about Jeffrey Dahmer or the Donner Party,
right.
and what I want my readers to know is that there's a surprising array of functions that cannibalism serves that have nothing to do with that.
I feel like cannibalism, much funnier than you would think.
Yeah.
So in the book, we should make clear you're not just writing about human cannibalism, but also about cannibalism sort of across the animal spectrum. But let's start with humans, because that's perhaps the one we go to first mentally and then kind of run away from. How common is cannibalism with humans?
Now?
Yeah.
I don't think it's common at all.
Is it? Does it still exist?
I would think possibly in mm-hmm. places where, let's say, where there's been a major famine or an agricultural collapse, you may have cannibalism taking place.
But what amazes me is that it occurred more recently than one would think. That in China they were eating people up through the 1960s.
Yeah, I think that had a lot to do with the fact that we have had in the West a long-standing taboo that I believe originated from the Greeks, mm-hmm. Homer and Odysseus and Polyphemus, the Cyclops, then the Romans, then Shakespeare, Titus Andronicus, and on and on. The Brothers Grimm, Daniel Defoe with Robinson Crusoe, and Sigmund Freud, and there has been this ball rolling of the fact that this thing is the worst taboo that you could possibly inflict on someone else. The early anthropologists the same way, mm-hmm. and so that became extremely pervasive, and I think that's why when we think of cannibalism, the first thing that we think of is horror. But I don't believe that the Chinese had that influence, at least early on. So they, I wish I came up with the term, but culture is king.
Right.
And so their culture dictated that it wasn't the worst thing that you could do.
Do they have stories around cannibalism and a sort of history?
Oh, no doubt. Their dynastic histories are just impeccable. They kept wonderful records. And mm-hmm. so you have all these recipes about how humans were cooked and the preferred way to do it. It was also used to terrorize. It was a branch of sort of filial piety, the Confucian concept that you take care of your elders when they get old and sick. And an extreme version of that would be you cut off a piece of your biceps or your thigh and you feed it to your grandparents if they're ill or hungry. I also think that they went through a lot of famines over the last thousands of years that have been well documented.
So that's about survival, which we're familiar with a little bit, the Donner Party and such. But you also write about Epicurean cannibalism and sort of eating people because it tastes good.
Yeah, and I think, once again, that was China and the fact that they that you'd go in, and I believe that this was probably done by powerful rulers who went in, took a place over, or they wanted to terrorize their there was probably some terror involved, and you know, there are cookbooks full of recipes. So there is this culinary cannibalism angle in China that I didn't really find elsewhere. Not to say it didn't exist in other cultures, but those cultures didn't keep the records, and they don't do it anymore. So it's very difficult to sort of pick that up.
And was it in China that they sort of established that children were the tastiest, followed by women, and then?
I'd read that, yeah.
And wow. Okay. Moving along to other members of the animal kingdom. How common is cannibalism in the world of non-humans?
This was the big surprise to me in writing this book, was that it is so widespread. Just about every group of animals, from microbes to Mormons, you found that this behavior existed. And in the animal kingdom, it's extremely common in things like insects, snails, arachnids, spiders, and scorpions. Mm-hmm. And then it's in the vertebrates, the backboned creatures, you find it's very common in fish. So a codfish that lays 1 million eggs, when it consumes some of its own eggs, it's not thinking about, well, I just ate Tony. They're thinking about, they're not thinking about anything, but it is a readily available, extremely safe, very nutritious food source. So it's really just foraging. Mm-hmm. And then there's parental cannibalism, which blew me away. All of these aspects of that behavior that have everything to do with promoting the survival of your offspring from laying trophic eggs, which are never going to develop. They're infertile eggs. And in a sense, I've been describing them as little kids' meals that are handed out to the hatchlings, if you're a spider or if you're a snail. So that was something that I was very surprised at. There are legless amphibians called caecilians, with a C, mm-hmm. so that my Italian relatives don't get upset at me.
I was going to say, I was wondering, in case someone wants to Google these creatures and see the action.
There are some of them lay eggs, and others give birth to live young. The ones that lay eggs, it had been noted that when these hatchlings come out, they squirm all over their moms, and people wondered about that behavior. And at a certain point, they took a look at it, and what they found was that these hatchlings were literally gripping onto their mother's skin and peeling her like a grape and consuming her skin. So they looked at the skin, and they said, well, it isn't really like regular epidermis. It's not dead, dried skin that's flaking off. It's full of fat, nutrients. So this is an evolved form of parental care. Then you look at the ones that give birth to live young, and somebody along the line realized that when these babies are born, they've got a weird little tooth. Mm-hmm. So they said, what if they're going to be eating? And then the tooth fell out not long after the baby's born. They said, what happened? Why did the teeth fall out of them? So they dissected some of the females, and they found that in the oviducts, the lining of the oviduct in the region where these babies were developing has been eaten away. So they're literally doing the same thing mm-hmm. that the egg layers did, peeling away the inside, in this instance, of the oviduct and feeding on it.
So presumably there's some kind of evolutionary reason why this behavior exists.
Sure.
And persists. Does it, as with humans, is there an instance in the animal world where it's sort of been phased out, where it did exist and now it no longer does?
What an interesting question. Not that I know of.
Okay.
No.
So no one's given it up other than us?
No, I don't think so. In fact, there are probably instances where if you increase the stress on a population, they are mm-hmm. going to resort to cannibalism where they normally wouldn't, because with all of the different reasons that cannibalism takes place out there, whether it's related to reproductive behavior or it's parental care or it's a lifeboat strategy. If you've got three fledglings in a nest and two of them are older than the little guy, and if there's not enough food, you boot the little guy out or you eat him.
Given that we're in the middle of this sixth extinction and that there is so much pressure on so many species, is cannibalism overall on the rise?
I couldn't say. Mm-hmm. But certainly there are people who are now going to be keeping an eye on that. And I think that the knee-jerk reaction in the media has been to look at, for example, an increase in cannibalism in polar bears. And I've seen all sorts of splashy headlines saying, polar bears driven to cannibalism by lack of ice. And in reality, polar bears have been consuming their cubs for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Could it be tied now? Could there be increases in cannibalism because male bears are now foraging in places where they didn't used to run into females and their cubs? Could be, but you need to be careful because as I said, it's really sort of it's a spectacular headline when you can say that change in environmental conditions brought upon by man have driven polar bears to become cannibals. And it's much more complex than that.
Right. So we found one sad polar bear fact that's not attributable to global warming. Okay. One thing, the most commonly cited instance of animal cannibalism that I've heard, at least, and I don't know what this says about me, but it's about the female spider, procreating with the male and then promptly, eating him. What is the purpose of that?
Well, you're probably talking about black widow spiders,
okay.
and that's the story that everybody heard growing up. I heard about that one and praying mantises, and first of all, the story does end with cannibalism, but to sort of back up and look at the research that was done on black widows, they found that these studies were done. The females had been starved, they were in captivity, and these are conditions that would increase the possibility that anything that comes in the line of sight is going to get eaten. And if it's a male, and he's so much smaller, sure. In reality, it does occur, but in my book, the coolest version of it is the sort of Australian cousin of the black widow, the Australian redback spider. And what the male does is, so they mate, and then he does this sort of somersault flip where he presents his abdomen right in front of the female's mouth. And she responds by consuming his abdomen. And so he
asked for it.
Yeah, he asked for it. So what the female is getting out of it is a good meal, and what the male is getting out of it is he's already passed on his genes, and he's providing the female with a meal, which would increase the likelihood that she's going to survive and pass on his genes.
I feel like there's like a terrible human analogy that you could make, but I won't make it. What's the weirdest or most disturbing or fascinating thing that you came upon that you didn't know before you wrote the book?
I'd have to say how commonplace medicinal cannibalism was in Europe for hundreds of years, especially given the fact that we've got this cannibalism taboo. And to realize that human body parts, just about anything that you can name, had been used to treat just about any disease that you can name, from blood being used to treat epilepsy, to powdered skull being taken for a number of different maladies, to consuming fat for skin disorders. This to me was really, really intriguing and a big surprise, given the fact that for hundreds and hundreds of years, Westerners had been going around conquering other indigenous groups, and the reason that they would use is that, well, these aren't even humans; they're cannibals. So I found that to be really fascinating, and it started in the Middle Ages, it ran through the Renaissance, and it really didn't peter out until the early 20th century. The Merck Index in the 20th century, early part of the 20th century, had powdered mummy in it as something that you could buy.
For what use?
Any number of different uses.
All right. Maybe better not to know the exact specifics. Bill, thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
The book again is Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History by Bill Schutt.
This is John Williams, and I'm here with my colleagues Greg Coles and Parl Sagal to talk about what we and other people are reading. Hey, guys.
Hey, John.
Hi, John.
So, Greg, let's start with the list. Anything interesting happening on it this week?
Yeah, the most interesting thing on the list is very interesting. George Saunders' debut novel, Lincoln in the Bardo, goes right to the top of the hardcover bestseller list. Wow. It's new at number 1. It's interesting. Saunders, of course, very famous as a writer of kind of futuristic short fiction. This is neither of those things. It's historical. It's a novel. And there it is. It's his first number 1 hit. He's been on the list before with a couple of story collections, but this is the first time he's gone all the way to number 1.
That's great.
The only other new titles in hardcover fiction are both series novels. Jonathan Kellerman continues his Alex Delaware series with Heartbreak Hotel. That's new at number 4. And Mark Greaney continues his Court Gentry series with Gunmetal Gray down at number 11. In nonfiction, there's just one new title this week. It is by the country singer and songwriter Rory Feek, who just won a Grammy last week. His memoir is called This Life I Live. It's new at number 2. It's really mostly a look at life with his wife, Joey Feek, who died of cancer last year. And this album that they won the Grammy for was a duet album, the two of them singing hymns together.
What about your personal reading?
Well, I'm still reading The Power Broker. You thought I was kidding when I said I'd be talking about this book for the next year and a half.
As bad as Pamela and Les Mis.
Actually, I didn't think you were kidding at all. I'd say a year and a half is
I'm just about 300 pages into this book, which, is a good-sized novel. 300 pages feels like I should be done with it already, and I'm not even a quarter done with this.
Moses is just getting warmed up.
It's still riveting. It's the book that I was reading kind of on the train and at bedtime, and I've now extended it to I'm reading it at my daughter's bedtime, not to her, but during cuddle time, I'll sneak this book into bed with me and keep reading it there. So I'm making a little more progress than I was. I'm now in the part where Governor Al Smith and FDR are kind of in a heated political battle for supremacy in New York. FDR is taking on Al Smith, who is out of the Tammany machine. So, it's great political power struggles and how Robert Moses kind of navigated all of those to his advantage. He started out as very much the idealist, but comes to realize he can pull the levers of power to make things happen. So
must be keeping your daughter wrapped.
I'm not reading it out loud.
It's funny. Now I'm thinking we should make a Power Broker for children. A condensed version.
Should we, John?
Maybe
the graphic novel.
Maybe kids are getting more mature these days.
They already work the levers of power. We don't need more.
That's true.
Not mine.
Parl, you are empty-handed. Does that mean you're not reading anything this week?
That means I don't need to use it as a prop. Nice. Because I'm reading something that I read every year. Do you have a book like this in a sort of ritual rereading?
I don't.
Yeah.
I don't. A couple of years ago, I thought that I would start doing that with The Sports Writer every Thanksgiving because it's set around Thanksgiving weekend, and I can probably knock it out in a holiday weekend.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll try that again this year.
Yeah. Greg, do you have anything you return to?
Not on a yearly basis.
Right.
I have read The Great Gatsby multiple times.
Yeah.
It's a novel that every few years I kind of feel the need to turn back to, and it's short. It's kind of pristine. It's there's you can read it in a weekend, and it's just so enjoyable to see.
And you've grown up with it, so you kind of I'm sure you encounter your old readerly self as you come back to it. At least I have this feeling when I go back to books.
That's true. I
see something different. I realize I had that wrong.
Well, exactly. And that book, of course, is set on the Long Island Sound side of Long Island, and I live on the Connecticut side of Long Island Sound. And so as an adult coming back to that book, it feels more concrete to me. He's talking about actual places. And in fact, it kind of surfaces early on in The Power Broker, too, where Robert Moses is breaking up many of those great estates that F. Scott Fitzgerald was writing about. So it's fun to kind of pull things from books that pertain to your life at different times. That's one reason I like revisiting.
For me, it's usually those shortish, kind of pristine-ish books that I'll read, like William Maxwell's So Long, See You Tomorrow I've reread, and Gilead I've reread, Marilyn Robinson's book. What are you? This was all
with
preface
my leading
to what
question.
you're reading. Yeah.
Yes.
I actually don't care what you guys are reading. Now I'm moving in.
Wake up, Parl. What are you reading?
Well, every year I reread, and it's usually in January, I read the collected comic strips of Alison Bechdel that are collected as the essential dykes to watch out for. And if you're a queer of a certain generation, now Alison Bechdel is very famous with Fun Home and whatnot, but like a number of us were reading her weekly strips in local papers following a group of very hapless friends living in a unidentified city in, I think it's Minnesota. And I mean, every year I would come back to this because it's just one of the best books about how we live with books and with other people and with politics, and how we watch the news with consternation and horror and turn to our friends and argue and outgrow people and meet new people. And it's just this Dickensian thing. And she wrote it from, I think, the mid-'80s to, I feel like she stopped writing it in the early aughts. So you really grow with these people. You see them have children. You see them divorce. And the group of people she follows are all queer people, trans people, immigrants, and not in a PC way, but in a way that, like, people who on the margins.
Life.
Well, people on the margins have similar strategies of survival and whatever else, and sneakiness and what. I mean, you find each other, and it's just this gossipy, perfect book. I think Dwight Garner, when you reviewed it years ago, said it was like one of the great gems of American literature, and it really is. Whether or not you like graphic novels, if you like political novels, if you like big soap operas, like it's
coming of age novels, group friends novels.
It's so good. It's so bloody
good. You're making
good.
me really want to dive in. I've read Fun Home and Are You My Mother?
You'll just eat it up.
I have not read the collected Dykes to Watch Out For, but I used to read Dykes to Watch Out For in the underground newspaper.
Did you really?
Yeah, sure. And it would appear kind of alongside Matt Groening's Life in Hell.
Huh.
And
we're meeting Underground Greg this week.
Long Island Greg.
I say underground newspapers, but I mean
like the
the
Voice.
Village Voice. Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're not really underground, but I mean the free weekly independent papers, and they would have Dan Savage's advice column, and they would have Dykes to Watch Out For, and they would have Life in Hell, the Matt Groening.
But it's one thing that you look at it, and it used to feel like a relic, but now I don't know if people read this great article in the paper a few days ago about how bookstores are again becoming these sites of resistance, and people are meeting and having these, and it's that era, and like the book not only charts the development of these friends, but it also charts like the dying off of independent bookstores. You see the rise of Barnes and Noble. These are deeply literary people, and you can see them worried and changing jobs and figuring out how to meet people, how to find the right book. It's just so good. It's just
you've sold a few copies.
I hope so.
Well, I'm gonna
I
buy one,
proselytize for this book. I really do. So
that's great.
John, what about you?
I'm still in Sabbath's Theater by Philip Roth, and it's funny because this segment has really. I'm a pretty quick reader to begin with, but I felt so much more pressure since I started appearing on this segment to try to get through like a different book every week so that there's something new to talk about. Obviously, Greg doesn't have that fear.
But it's also, you're so honest. You could say anything.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, I'm halfway through The Power Broker. That's right. No, but Sabbath's Theater is I don't know if either of you have read it, but it's fantastic.
Oh yeah, it's one of my very favorite Philip Roth books.
Yeah, the writing is incredible, and it's also. It has this thing. There are some scenes between the husband, whose name is Mickey Sabbath. He's a puppeteer, and he's sort of grieving the loss of his longtime lover, and he's in this sort of cold, bitter marriage. And there are scenes between him and his wife screaming at each other, just straight out of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. I mean, they're great. And then and there's just a bitterness in the book, and you have to like this kind of thing, obviously. But there are so many sort of potent, funny, short sentences about that feeling, and he talks about the wife resenting Mickey for not wanting children. And then he says, once her childbearing years were behind her, Rosanna was able better to pinpoint her hatred and to despise him for the simple fact that he existed.
Actually, I will jump in and say that in light of that, I also did read a very short, bleak Jewish comic novel in the past couple of weeks, and it is David Grossman's new novel, A Horse Walks Into a Bar, which Gary Steingart reviews on the cover of our March 5th issue.
Oh, great.
It is a comic novel and very much a Jewish comic novel. It's about an Israeli stand-up comedian, but it is tormented. Very, very much in kind of a Rothian way. It's this very bleak, dark, anguished comedy.
That sounds like the perfect follow-up.
Yeah,
I'll have to grab a copy off the shelf.
Unhappy marriages make for the best literature. Why is that?
Well, the best rock songs, the best everything. Unhappiness makes for the best everything.
Maybe not the
Well,
best
Chekhov has
marriages.
that great quote that, like, don't marry unless you're prepared to be intensely lonely, so, which I think is something.
On that note, love advice.
From Pearl and Chekhov.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.